Good morning. It's good to see you all this morning. We're going to go ahead and get started. I'll make some housekeeping announcements before we get to our featured speaker today. I want to welcome those of you who may be new to All Saints Church and visiting us this morning for the first time. I want to encourage you that if you want to be kept apprised of future events of interest here at All Saints Church, there are green contact sheets available at either entrance exit, so please be sure to stop by and fill out all of your contact information so that we can be in touch with you. Also, there is a welcome table on the lawn where you can pick up a red welcome bag, which includes a welcome card, and that is also something that you can fill out so that we have your contact information. You can give that back to us, and we'll, again, get you on our mailing list to keep you apprised of future events. And in that bag, you will also find some really wonderful informational material, in particular about ministries and other upcoming events here at All Saints Church. So please do stop by the welcome table on the lawn if you can. Want to point out that our restrooms are outside the glass doors over here as I'm pointing to my left, and our exits are available essentially at every corner of this forum. So just so you know, if you're new and if you've never known before. Each week we put our faith into action, and this Sunday we write to our members of Congress asking for their support for the reauthorization of the Global Food Security Act, which works to empower farmers by strengthening their access to financing, markets, land rights, and by women's leadership in agriculture. The Global Food Security Act also emphasizes the importance of nutrition interventions in the critical 1,000-day window from a woman's pregnancy to the child's second birthday. Reauthorization will continue this program with a further emphasis on nutrition programs, better integration of water, sanitation, and hygiene needs into programs, and an increased focus on strengthening communities' ability to adapt to changing external conditions. So please stop by the action table that's available on the lawn this Sunday to participate in this week's action. And then finally, a reminder that it is your generosity that makes a difference here at All Saints Church. Please consider making a pledge to All Saints if you can, to continue to spread justice and healing in the community, the nation, and the world. And now let me introduce our Rector's Forum speaker today, David Korten. He is the president of Living Economies Forum, co-founder of Yes Magazine, member of Club Rome, and author of books including When Corporations Rule the World, The Great Turning from Empire to Earth Community. His latest book is Change the Story, Change the Future. And I should note that both of these books are available for purchase over here with Christina at the table. That'll open up as soon as the presentation's over. You can go purchase your books. He is a former Harvard Business School professor. He holds an MBA and PhD degrees from Stanford Business School. He lived and worked for 21 years in Africa, Asia, and Latin America on a quest to end global poverty. His current work centers on finding the path to ecological civilization grounded in the values of understanding 21st century enlightenment. David is a great friend to All Saints Church, and so we are very delighted to have him back. Please join me in welcoming David Korten.
Thank you. It is such a joy to be back here at All Saints with so many friends. I'm just sorry it's been so long since I was last able to visit. And I want to thank Marty Coleman for remaking the connection. And I do miss Ed Bacon. Look forward to meeting your new rector. The title for this session, I'm sure you all saw this in the program, Choice Point for Humanity. It's a fundamental question that we now face as the human species. Will we continue on the path of imperial civilization, which is outlined in the Great Turning? a pathway to species self-extinction and potential destruction of Earth's capacity to support life. This is a very important set of issues that I am sure is not new to any of you. Or will we take the step to an ecological civilization, which in the Great Turning I talk about as Earth Community, which was the kind of the UN frame of the Earth Charter, which would be a journey toward a whole new set of relationships of caring for one another and Earth, to creating a world that truly works for all creatures, all of creation. It is a choice that it's extraordinary the extent to which people pretty much everywhere are coming into awareness of the significance of the situation we've gotten ourselves into. And yet there is very little public conversation of that reality. So people are sitting quietly, having no idea what to do. Now, it may seem overly simple, but the key line of what I'm going to be sharing, we have to change the story. Change the story about how we think about ourselves and our relationship to the earth that birthed and nurtured us. And this requires doing what many of you are doing, and which I see increasingly as a challenge for the faith community, of engaging publicly in the deepest of conversations that calls into question all of our established beliefs and frameworks, and then in turn draws from all of the sources of human knowledge and understanding to create a deeper frame, in a sense a truly interfaith frame, but goes way beyond interfaith to between faith and science, indigenous communities, modernity. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And the reason I happen to be here in this lovely part of the country is because I'm attending a conference over at Claremont, the Claremont School of Theology, put on by the Institute for Postmodern Development of China on ecological civilization. And Andrew Swartz, who is a key staff member over at Claremont, I'm privileged to have him join me, and he may join in the conversation to add some information. The thing that's distinctive about this conference is not only the depth of the conversation, but the fact of the extent of the involvement of China. I've never been to a conference in the United States in which most of the participants are from another country. And that is true here. They've brought together this incredible delegation of some of China's most important thinkers. And what brings us together is the official commitment of the Chinese government, the Chinese Communist Party, written into their constitution, the commitment to move to an ecological civilization. Yeah. Now, it's interesting. I lived for 15 years in Southeast Asia and Indonesia and the Philippines. I never got to China. So I made my first trip to China a year ago last November as a result of the folks at Claremont. Just astonishing. It's hard to get our minds around the complexity of China. You think, first of all, They have a population the size of the United States, plus 1 billion people. Now, you know, we have a few problems getting things together with our small little population. And of course, they have a communist government running the most aggressive and successful capitalist economy in the entire world. Makes China a very interesting place. Now, so many of the themes come together with the 2 books of mine that are on sale. And this whole thing is, to me, a continued learning experience. I find myself just continuously pushed to think more deeply, more connections between more pieces of the puzzle, exactly what we all need to be doing. And part of it is trying to get my mind around what China has done. Now, a key theme of my book, Change the Story, Change the Future, is this idea that one of the things that makes us distinctively human is our ability to live our stories. Of course, what this really means is that we get a framework in our heads about our understanding about the nature of reality, the nature and purpose of creation, what it means to be human, how those play out together. Now, as far as I'm aware, there's no other species that has the ability we have to imagine a future and choose to create it. Now, it's also essential to our ability to live together that we are conditioned as we are born and grow up within our culture to integrate ourselves into the understanding of that culture so that we have some shared perceptions that allow us to live together. So that is deep in our nature. But the thing that's distinctive about our nature is our ability to choose our story and thereby choose our future. And if we get our story wrong, we get everything wrong. And that goes right to the heart of our current problem. We've got it deeply, deeply wrong. And here's an extraordinary thing about China that I'm just, becoming to appreciate with awe and wonder. Their ability as a society to choose a story and organize around it. So a few decades ago, they got very interested in a guy named Marx. And they decided communism is what we're going to do. So they did it with a vengeance. They learned it from the Russians, but they did it a whole lot more purely than the Russians ever did. But then, as it began to play out, they realized, that's not really working for us the way we want. So, we have another idea. So basically, they turned to the United States, said, well, we'll try capitalism. And they now do that a whole lot better than the United States does. Their GDP grows faster, and the real accomplishment, they're producing billionaires a whole lot faster than we are. Now, you need to put that together, and one of the things we have to do is understand, what is this thing called capitalism? And I frankly have tended to avoid using the term because I don't want to get into those kinds of political, ideological discussions. But I'm beginning to realize, as I think the Chinese are realizing, that we also have to kind of understand what are the critical elements of capitalism. And to put it very simplistically, it's fundamentally about money. Fundamentally about money. And we manage the economy to make money. That's what GDP growth is about. And we have these things called banks, and they have computers, and there are numbers in these computers. We call money financial assets. And we're organizing and managing the whole economy, which ultimately becomes the management and organization of the whole society, to grow the numbers in those computers, which is really what money is. And to do that, we are destroying Earth's capacity to sustain life, and we are destroying the social fabric of a society that allows us to live. Now, it's interesting, we think of ourselves as an intelligent species. This is the ultimate insanity. And I see you nodding your heads. And you know, that's almost the universal reaction I get. The thing that constantly amazes me is I get invited to do these presentations and I don't tell you anything that you don't already know. And it is so obvious, you could sort of ask, well, did you have to have a PhD to figure that out? You've actually got a better chance figuring out if you don't have a PhD. Particularly a PhD in economics. That's the death sentence on the ability to use your brain. But this gets us down to the fundamental change. In a way, well, we have, in a very literal sense, organized our whole global society now around corporations. Rather than organizing as living communities of people and nature working together to create and maintain our mutual living, we organize around corporations, which are legally chartered pools of money that operate as a kind of robotic, mechanistic instrument to run the whole of human society around growing those numbers. Wow. But that's what we have to change. And the first thing is simply getting out into the public conversation, in our public awareness, not just our individual awareness. Now listen, this is really radical. Would you believe we humans are living beings? Is anybody shocked? We are born of and nurtured by a living earth. Anybody shocked yet? Our health and well-being depends on Earth's health and well-being. Oh. Well, maybe it would be a good idea if we sort of step back and figure out, how do we organize ourselves as living beings who are members of Earth's community of life? And this is the other really extraordinary thing. Science, if you follow the current astronomy, we used to not long ago think that our galaxy was the only galaxy. Now the scientists estimate there are 2 trillions of them in the universe. That's a lot of galaxies. And each one of those has billions, if not trillions of stars. And imagine how many planets that would come to. And the odds are it's quite possible there is another planet someplace that has the capacity that our planet has to sustain life as we know it. But we have not yet found one. So far as we know, this is the only one. Wow. That's kind of special. Out of this whole of creation. Now, I find very commonly when I mention to people that we are on a path to being the first Earth species ever to choose its own extinction. The common response is, but once we're gone, Earth will recover. Wow. Wow. Earth is more important than we are, which I would agree. But the other piece is, we have the capacity to destroy Earth's ability to recover before we go. You know, the clearest, easiest way to do that would be with an atomic war, a nuclear war. But we could also do it by destroying, so depleting Earth's natural systems that it cannot recover. Can you imagine the responsibility that imposes on us? The responsibility. So, what we get to, it's not that we simply have to change to save ourselves. We have a fundamental responsibility to creation, however we choose to define that. To change our relationship to Earth, to become Earth healers. To work with Earth, to restore Earth's capacity to continuously regenerate our soils, our water, our atmosphere, maintain the balance of the climate. You know, and this is part of what we're learning in biology that's so extraordinary. And we barely understand how it works, but it is clear that, so far as we know, life exists only in communities that self-organize and create the means of their own existence, the conditions essential to their own existence. And that is very key to understanding ourselves and where we need to go as a species. Now, do you think the faith community has any role in this? We have two sets of institutions in society that we turn to for our understanding, our common understanding of reality, of creation, and of our place within it, and what that means in terms of how we play out our lives. The institutions of education and the institutions of religion. So in this community, we have the question, are the institutions of religion being helpful in that regard? To the extent that they're not, what can we do to make it so? Now, I want to move into opening this up for a discussion of that question, but before I want to mention one of the projects that Andrew is very deeply engaged in, And this has to do with the World Parliament of Religions, which of course is the leading interfaith organization in the world. And the folks at Claremont are working with the leadership of the Parliament in the planning of the next conference in Toronto in November to bring into the discussions there the discussion of this human transition to an ecological civilization. And we're just beginning to put together how that can work. And of course, the Parliament is a very complicated organization in its own right. But it's fascinating to me how it is evolving over time from, we need to get all the world's religions together to respect one another, which is an important first step. But it seems now to be gradually moving to where do we find the truth in each of our religions? And recognizing that there is no source of wisdom, there is no individual thinker, there's no book to read that tells us the whole story. To repeat, we have to go where humans have never gone before. And it requires living together with an understanding, a common understanding that we humans have never had before. Particularly as a global species, which is totally new. It's something that most of us, I think, in this room of our generation have lived through, the whole human shift from, in a sense, isolated national tribes to being a truly interdependent, interrelated global civilization. And we haven't figured out what to do about that. But we now have to go in a very different direction and drawing from all of our knowledge, all of our understanding, and everybody has to be a contributor to that learning process. So I want to stop there, and I don't know if you have any comments you want to add about the Parliament. Okay. One of the things that's essential here is recognizing the extent to which people already know in their hearts and their consciousness the truth of the fundamentals of what I've laid out. In the sense that I have not told you anything you don't know. And so if that's true, the more we kind of share that, we're living beings born of and nurtured by a living earth. Yeah, I get that, I know that. If we can get out on the table, then we can start talking openly and seriously about, okay, what does that mean for how we get there? So, reactions, questions, if there's something I said you don't understand, you want clarification, fine.
So we have two volunteers
here. Thank you very much, Mr. Korten, for that. Very stimulating, and also for your books, which have been genuinely helpful. I'm a trustee of the Parliament, and in fact, working with Philip Clayton and John Cobb for Toronto. So these discussions are extremely important, and I'm very happy you're here this morning. So there's one puzzle that I have, because there is a fundamental contradiction between capitalism and the values of earth sustainability that you are invoking today. And certainly we see that contradiction in corporate capitalism. So the fact that the Chinese have now taken up capitalism with a vengeance is not particularly good news, unless there's something drastically different, which you haven't told us about Chinese capitalism. Because if it's more of the same done with 1 billion plus people, then that's not good news for the planet at all. And so unless you can tell us what it is about the Chinese, I will go away deeply depressed. So perhaps you can enlighten us why you are so hopeful about the Chinese, because everything that you've said so far doesn't give us grounds for hope.
That is beautifully stated, and I, I totally agree with you. Again, we come back to China's very large and very complex society, and what is unique about it is they are able to take an idea and move. And it's actually been exploring these issues kind of within the Chinese frame that I'm getting even clearer in my mind. And you know, how clear can you be than being the person that wrote When Corporations Rule the World that capitalism is a problem. But getting it down to the really simple part of understanding that the whole frame of capitalism is around money, and that the ultimate test of capitalist success is really the rate at which you're producing billionaires. Now, I'll have to be honest that one of the things that disappointed me about this conference, and we can talk about why, was that there was very little discussion of corporations, how the capitalist frame is the problem, and what the implications of that are. But what I see as the hopeful thing is the Chinese beginning to recognize that what they are doing, and I guess they actually call it communism with a Chinese face, or what, but they also recognize that it is capitalism, but they're recognizing it doesn't work. I mean, clearly, absolutely, it does not work in terms of nature and the ecological piece, which also was totally missing from Marxism. So, you know, think of it as a process of a nation of 1.3 to 4 billion people learning. They are very clear that what they're doing is a disaster environmentally, and that is really important. The other thing that I think they're beginning to realize is that, well, okay, we produce a few billionaires, but what about the rest of the people? And the rest of the people, it's the same thing that's happening in the United States. We draw a very clear parallel. Most of the people are living in near desperation. And that's something I don't think we fully recognize in the United States either. That, you know, I read a book recently called The Disappearing Middle Class. And what we're doing is splitting into two economies. There's roughly 20% of the people that are involved in the financial sector and the electronics, high tech, and so forth. And if you're in the good jobs there, you know, roughly 20% of the people are somewhere on incomes up over $100,000, which is enough to pay the rent and make sure you got food on the table and so forth. But meanwhile, our median income is more somewhere around $60,000 a year. And, you know, so amazing that when those of my generation, those of us were growing up, we had a middle class and we had a family. You had one income earner that took care of the family's need for housing and food and so forth. Now, two people with full-time jobs are not enough. You got to have 2 or 3 people, and you got to have 2 or 3 jobs, and it's, you know, it's a frantic existence for roughly 80% of the people. Well, it's the same kind of division in China, and you know, waking up to all around that this basic framework doesn't work. So then, how do we get a kind of common terminology, a kind of common paradigm of a living world, and begin to figure out what it means to reorganize around that? And hopefully our faith institutions can play a role. But the hope is that the discussion is starting, not that we're finding real solutions.
Bob, there's right here first.
Oh.
Hi. What you've said is all very interesting, but you've only touched on one issue which I think is embedded in capitalism, which is the population on this planet. The Chinese represent, I understand, a quarter of the planet right now, and they have to feed these people. And they decided after many other approaches that capitalism would put more food in their mouths. I would like you, if you would be willing, to talk about the consequences of 8 billion people on this planet.
Yeah. Actually, I think, apart from my notes, I think I didn't mention the two defining statistics of our time. One, that environmentally we're consuming 1.7 times what Earth can sustain. So that's leading to environmental devastation. And the other is that in terms of concentration of wealth, 8 individuals now, their total financial assets are equal to the poorest half of humanity, some 3.67 billion people. That's way too much inequality. Now, I am very much among those who think we've let our population get out of control. We have to, as a species, bring ourselves into balance with the planet. And we cannot individually consume more than our share, and yet the way we have organized it is virtually impossible to lead a decent life in this world without consuming more than our share. I became very conscious of some of the simple implications here when I lived in New York City. Now, you take the difference between New York City and Los Angeles. In New York City, you have to be an idiot to have a car. You know, it's useless and it's very expensive. You know, you have wonderful public transportation. At least when I was there, most everything you needed was in walking distance of your apartment and so forth. If you live in Los Angeles, you know, if there's anybody here that's figured out how to live in the Los Angeles area without 1 car per adult in the family, in the household, please let me know about it. It's virtually impossible. Well, that's just part of what we need to be rethinking through in terms of the restructuring. But the issue of managing our population and getting beyond this idea that you know, God may have commanded us to go forth and populate the planet. We've done that. That's we don't need any more of that. We now have to learn to live in balance with the planet. So how do we do that? At least the Chinese gave it a real try at one point, and they didn't quite figure out how to do that. And be clear, I'm not holding up the Chinese as a positive example of how to do things. I'm simply holding them up as a nation, a culture that is beginning to frame the questions in the way that I think is potentially helpful to the whole of humanity.
You raise a lot of issues that have multi-layers, so it's very hard to address them.
Yes.
In regards to Adam Smith and The Wealth of Nations, have you read The Theory of Moral Sentiments? Because it's
Yes.
part 2 of his position, which most people have not read The Theory of Moral Sentiments, and it's very hard to go through if you're aware. So there's a moral responsibility that goes with capitalism. And so I am not anti-billionaire, and some people here know I went through a very difficult time after being single, self-supporting my whole life, not finding a job, resulting in consequences. I'm not opposed to billionaires. I worked for a wonderful billionaire family. And it was a billionaire that actually introduced me to the theory of moral sentiments. And he, as an individual, changed the way that he ran his corporation. I worked for a multinational global corporation. And so a lot of these questions I've held. I think just to call capitalism bad and it doesn't work, there's been so much corruption and so many layers of different forms of governance that have been introduced that it's, I think it just goes much deeper, I guess.
Yeah.
But one thing I just want to say too, I have a problem with people making decisions in this realm who haven't sort of lived it themselves, making decisions to, you know, buy organic, to, you know, here, and I love this place, but I can't even go into the bathroom because of the toxic sprays that are used. You know, that affects our environment and our health. So there's I think there's individual knowledge, and I think there's individual decisions that need to be made versus a group of people coming together trying to form another system. But I guess I would love to, I've read your website, and I would just love to go further into this conversation. So.
Well, these are exactly the conversations we need to have. I'm very focused on systems. It's interesting that, you know, having been to business school, my field was organization. It's all about how you organize, how you set the rules and the structures of an institution to shape behavior. And when you get into these larger global institutions, you see all the ways that they shape our behavior. I also know, you know, some wonderful billionaires who are working very hard to use their money to help facilitate this transition. So I'm not blaming billionaires, but I am blaming an economic system that treats the creation of billionaires as accomplishment rather than measuring the economic performance in relation to the quality of life of all people in relation to nature. You say it's a very complex set of issues that we have given very little attention to, and the starting point is to open up that conversation. And I see we are right at the hard stop.
We'll take one last question.
Okay.
Yes. The capitalistic system has proven to be reasonably good at producing large quantities of goods effectively, not equitably, not well distributed, and certainly the proceeds from that production are not at all well distributed. But part of the main problems with the early communist, early Chinese capitalism are corruption. They've had large incentives to build buildings where their capitalism would say there's no need and no profit to be made from doing it. And so that's been a major source of their downfall.
Yeah.
We do need to address the human population on the world, and if we live in one square block and have to live off what we produce there, or we live in one whole square world and have to live off what it produces, we've grown like weeds. We've started out living in very hospitable areas with supplies of water and other resources, and have grown to where we live in virtually all environments on the globe. So capitalism has used resources where they were inexpensive and maybe limited or even challengingly unavailable in the long run because it's profitable. So it isn't an effective mechanism for making sure we're good husbands of the world. And I think we need to look at, as you mentioned earlier, the total population as well as how we use resources over the long run.
Is there a question for David?
I'd like to see what he thinks of the question of
Yeah. The way I think about the future that we have to create is, given our overconsumption as a species, and that overconsumption tends to be by the best off 20% of us, while the other 80% is often deprived of the basic means of living. We have to think in terms of creating a world, an economy, that secures material sufficiency for everyone and does it in a way that gives us spiritual abundance for everyone. So think about how would we organize as communities in balance with our local ecosystems, doing it in ways, like the organic farming and the things that many of the youth are doing, going back to the soil and so forth, to create the basic means of material living in a balanced relationship with our ecosystems, and doing it in ways that are spiritually fulfilling. Fulfilling in our sense of connections with one another and with Earth, that give us the optimal opportunity to utilize our human capacity for creativity, for beauty, for love. I think it's a possibility, but we've only barely begun to ask even what would such an economy look like? What would the institutions look like? Now again, those of, I'll say, our generation have lived through some of the most dramatic changes in history during our lifetimes in terms of an awakening to the environmental issues, the civil rights movement, and recognizing the need to move beyond the exclusion of people of color. The women's movement and bringing into equality of men and women and the roles. We saw the end of the colonial domination of India. We saw the fall of apartheid in South Africa. We saw the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Berlin Wall and the beginning to come together, and that was a process that I know many members of this church were deeply involved in. We know that we can change very rapidly, and our challenge here is how can we use our capacity to reframe our understanding through the institutions of religion and education in particular, to make this shift as fast as those other shifts took place.
Thank you, David, for being with us.